So the next part of my presentation is to talk to you about critical thinking in an inquiry-based classroom. And there are several questions I want to address in this section. The first question is, why is critical thinking so important? The second question is, what is theory of knowledge in the IB diploma? Because theory of knowledge is essentially the critical thinking part of the program. Thirdly, how can students generate good knowledge questions? The fourth question is, why is language so important to critical thinking? And then the fifth important question is, why should we make thinking visible in the classroom? Now, at the same time, there are several key knowledge questions that we always address with our students, and we're going to talk through those at the same time. So the first question is, what do we know and how do we know it? A very important critical thinking question. The second question is, what are the differences and similarities across the different areas of knowledge? Because part of being a good critical thinker is that ability of a student to make connections across the different subject areas. The third question is, how reliable are the methods that we use to generate knowledge in the different areas of knowledge? So reliability, certainty, and truth being a very important aspect of critical thinking. The next big question is, how does knowledge change over time? So we'll look at how we do that with the students. What is the impact of the knower on knowledge? And finally, how does culture affect knowledge, attitudes, assumptions, and beliefs? Okay, so the first question is, why is critical thinking so important? And of course, the key answer to that is that sound critical thinking is vital because our knowledge claims lead to action and have an impact on the world. So, for example, when students are doing service activities, students need to be thinking about the knowledge and the knowledge claims that they're making that will lead to those service opportunities. So they need to be making a connection between knowledge in the classroom and its impact on the real world. A second example of this is science in action. Science in the real world is used very often to solve very important problems, for example, global warming. So students really need to understand that the scientific claims they're making in a biology class, in a chemistry class, in a physics class, could potentially have very real impact on the world. It's also the case that with ethical dilemmas, students need to learn and understand that the ideas that they're producing, that the critical thinking they're using to make decisions about ethical dilemmas is again going to have an impact on their own lives and on the lives of people around them. Personal lives also are impacted with critical thinking, and also, of course, we live in a world that is filled with fake news. We've heard a lot about this on social media, so students today in the 21st century must have an understanding of how to assess truth and certainty and reliability, especially in the media. The second big question then is, what is theory of knowledge in the IB diploma? So this is a requirement of the IB diploma for grades 11 and 12. It's a course about critical thinking, cultural awareness, and personal growth. It's a course which also explores questions about knowledge, certainty, beliefs, assumptions, and truth. It's a standalone course, so it's taught separately as a separate class, but at the same time, it makes some very, very important connections between different subjects across the curriculum. It's at least 100 hours of coursework over 2 years. It's fully assessed by the IB, and it's assessed through an essay and a presentation. So the aims of this course are to help students know about knowing. So in other words, they are developing their metacognitive abilities, their understanding of how we think about the ways we think and the ways we critically appraise knowledge and knowledge claims. We're helping students to identify and explore knowledge issues. We're also developing critical and creative thinking skills. We're making links within and across the different subjects. Students are also developing self-awareness and cultural understanding. They're also exploring assumptions, attitudes, and beliefs. We also ask students to explore a range of different perspectives on different issues across the curriculum. And therefore, as a whole, these students are becoming much more tolerant, much fairer, and more open-minded. Now, the key part of theory of knowledge is that we are teaching students to explore knowledge issues. And what that means is that they're identifying and exploring problems with knowledge across all the areas of knowledge. So from languages, also to human sciences, natural sciences, mathematics, and the arts. And exploring knowledge questions and knowledge issues means asking questions like, What is knowledge, certainty, and truth? What are these things? What do they mean? What's the impact of the knower, the person who knows things, on the knowledge that we're producing? How certain can we be in subjects like mathematics, history, chemistry, and the arts? How true is a literary interpretation? So a very important question to be asked by students who are studying literature in Korean or English or any other language. What are the limitations of our senses when we're observing a scientific experiment? So that's a typical theory of knowledge question or knowledge issue that we address in the sciences. And then finally, how does my own culture affect my beliefs around many, many areas of the curriculum and also beyond the curriculum as well? So we want students to question the validity of claims in our subjects and how they're justified. We're asking students to ask questions about knowledge in our subjects. So for example, how knowledge is constructed, whether it's useful, to what extent it's true, how reliable it is, and what are its strengths and limitations. We also want students to view the claims we make in our subjects, the knowledge claims, the statements we make, from very different perspectives. So we want students to explore gender perspectives, cultural perspectives, different religious perspectives, and also historical, economic, and educational perspectives as well. So the fastest and the easiest way to achieve all of this is to get students to ask great knowledge questions so that our students are inquiring about knowledge and about knowledge issues in subjects all the time across the curriculum as a whole. So the key question then is, how can students generate good knowledge questions? That's the big question here. Knowledge questions are questions about truth and certainty. So they relate to anything, for example, academic disciplines, global issues, personal beliefs, current events. And a great knowledge question, first of all, is about knowledge. It's not a question about the content of a subject. It's about the knowledge and questions about how we acquire, how we search for, how we shape, how we produce, and how we accept different forms of knowledge. They're open questions, so they're questions that can have many different answers because we want students to explore the range of claims and counterclaims within the question, within the knowledge issue. And another key point about a great knowledge question is that it uncovers possible uncertainties in that area or body of knowledge. So we're talking about biases, we're talking about limitations, we're talking about problems with the ways of knowing, how we come to know things. We're talking about how we justify knowledge and information and the methods that we use to verify information. So great knowledge questions are questions about reliability, justification, evidence, certainty, knowledge, proof, reality, and truth. And they also examine the ways that we come to know things. For example, reasoning as a way of knowing, sense perception as a way to know things, for instance, in the sciences. Emotion, we use emotion a lot in different areas of knowledge to help us understand and know new things. Language, faith, the role of imagination, especially in the arts, or for example, when we are analyzing a piece of literature or a poem, we use our imagination to understand and to bring meaning to the text. Memory is very important. If we think about history and we think about the eyewitnesses that we use in history to verify events that happened, memory becomes a very, very important way of knowing. And then, of course, intuition is something we use across the different subjects. So I want to show you how these knowledge questions are constructed and also the difference between the types of questions we ask normally in a subject, the questions about content and about skills, and how they're different from knowledge questions. So here, for example, we have a question from the human sciences, and a typical question that you would ask in that subject is, will predictions on teenage smoking turn out to be correct? So it's a typical question for the subject of human sciences. But it's not a knowledge question because it's not about knowledge. It's not about certainty and truth. So a better question for knowledge and for critical thinking is, to what extent can the human sciences use mathematical techniques to make accurate predictions? So what that question is doing is it's starting to explore the reliability, the truth aspects, the aspects of certainty and accuracy within this particular topic. Here's another example from literature. A good subject question would be, how does George Orwell use symbolism to convey ideas about dictatorship in the novel 1984? But a good knowledge question would be, to what degree of accuracy can literary symbols convey the truth about political realities? So again, it's a question that's about things like accuracy and truth in relation to the topic. Here's another example from biology. A subject question would be, what is the result of this experiment that the students have just completed? But a good knowledge question would be, how can the biologist be sure of his or her conclusions given that they're based on hypothesis and experiment? So again, it's a question about certainty. Here's a final question, a final example for geography and mathematics. So a good subject question would be, what does this mathematical model tell us about future population growth in Africa? Very typical question either for mathematics or for geography. But a good knowledge question would be, how can a mathematical model give us knowledge even if it does not yield accurate predictions? So again, it's about knowledge, it's about accuracy, it's about truth. And it's really opening up the question, getting the students to think critically and be more open-minded about the topic. So this is something that we give to students. It's called the Knowledge Question Generator. This is something our teachers have produced here at Branksome Hall Asia. And the idea is it helps students to really think about how to construct good knowledge questions. So they would start in the center of the diagram here with a question prompt. So something like, to what extent, or how certain can we be that, or how reliable is something? And they work their way out through the rings. And what we've got here are all the ways of knowing. So things like sense perception, emotion, memory, imagination. And then out here we've got words related to certainty and reliability and truth. And then we've got the actual topics and subject matters on the outside. So for example, I could look at this and I could try to generate a good knowledge question, and I would say something like, so to what extent can sense perception help us to be more certain in the natural sciences? And that's a really good question. So you're asking about the role of sense perception and how that helps us to achieve greater certainty when, for example, we're doing experiments in the natural sciences. Okay? So I've used that diagram to come up with a really good knowledge question. One more example. I could start here. I could say, how can we know that the imagination can give us a sense of reality when we are analyzing a text in literature? Okay? So again, we're talking about the role of imagination to give us a sense of certainty and truth when we're assessing or analyzing a work of art or a work of literature. So it's a very, very powerful question generator that our students use all the time to develop good knowledge questions. So the fourth big question I want to ask is, why is language so important to critical thinking? And there are three answers to this. The first answer is that words are so commonly misused and abused, and particularly words that relate to areas to do with truth, to do with certainty. And I'm talking about words like truth. We often use the word truth out of context or in different ways. We use the word fact very often when in fact it's not a fact. We often say, I know something, when actually we really mean I believe something. And again, the word belief is often misused. And this is very common, not just in the English language, but across all languages globally. The second point is that misuse of these words spreads misinformation and falsehoods. And I've talked earlier about fake news in the social media world. So it's a very, very important issue today and always. And then the third point is that if students are going to be future ambassadors, either for their profession or for their own personal beliefs or for their cultures, then they need to use these words accurately. Okay, so the key question then is, how do we define and explore key terms? And the words that I'm talking about are words like knowledge, fact, interpretation, assumption, certainty, truth, and belief. All words that we use very, very frequently and very often in theory of knowledge and also in everyday life. So, for example, with students, we'll explore definitions of knowledge, and we'll take, for instance, the Platonic definition, which is justified true belief. For a word like interpretation, well, when you're interpreting a poem or a work of art, for example, you're going to be either interpreting it very subjectively within yourself, or you can also interpret it objectively. So there are different ways to interpret something. And then with a word like certainty, which we overuse all the time, and students will often say, I'm certain of this, I'm sure of something, we need to get students to understand that it's important to know, first of all, what kinds of evidence are being used to support that degree of certainty, but also how much evidence is needed. When can you stop collecting evidence and say, yes, I know this fact and I'm certain that it's true? So these are very important questions to be asking. And to take one example, the question of knowledge, the word knowledge, you can see here that there are various different ways to interpret that particular word, to define that word. We've talked about the Platonic definition of justified true belief. There's also, we talk with students about situated knowledge, which is knowledge that's specific to a particular situation. We can also talk about the differences between religious knowledge and scientific knowledge. Religious knowledge, of course, to believers being knowledge that comes from God, and then scientific knowledge, which is knowledge that comes directly from the scientific method. So that brings me to my fifth big question, which is why should we be making all this thinking that we're doing, this critical thinking, why should we make thinking visible in the classroom so that we can actually see it happening? And a very quick definition of visible thinking is that visible thinking is a flexible, systematic, research-based approach to integrating the development of students' thinking with content learning across all the subject areas. So visible thinking is a set of thinking routines around a specific topic or a specific question. And what it does is it leads students towards 4 identical ideals, which are understanding, truth, fairness, and creativity. And the idea is that these thinking routines are designed to make thinking visible and concrete. So we use language on a whiteboard, we use language on an A3 sheet of paper, we act out ideas that are language-based, but in terms of the critical thinking behind them. So the aims of visible thinking are, first of all, to visualize our thinking, to make it visible, to track how our thinking changes over time. So often we'll have students writing up their ideas on a whiteboard and then coming back a week later to add ideas as their thinking grows. And then over time they can go back and they can look and see what that looks like and look at themselves and say, so I had that assumption 3 weeks ago, then I had this extra bit of information, now I think differently. And it's a very powerful way to get students to track and trace the progress of their thinking. It's also designed to self-assess our thinking and to improve our reasoning. So again, students can look at what they've put down on the page and they can see that there are problems with their reasoning, or perhaps there's not enough evidence to support their claims. It's also to improve the quality of arguments and evidence, because as we've said before, to get students to really think well critically, they need to understand the importance and the role of evidence. So visible thinking leads to a deeper understanding of content. It also leads to greater motivation for learning. It also develops the learner's thinking abilities, and it also gives us a shift in classroom culture because it really does help students to engage more enthusiastically in the thinking process, in the sharing of ideas, in group discussions, and in collaborative activities. So the next big question is, what are the key knowledge questions that we address with our students? And then to refer back to visible thinking, what are the visible thinking strategies that we use to address these questions? So I'm going to take you through some of the key knowledge questions, and I'll show you how we use visible thinking to address them. So the first example I'm going to show you is the way in which we sometimes get students to explore the knowledge spectrum. And the big question for the students here is, what are the differences and similarities across the different areas of knowledge? And so this is an activity where students get together, they have all the various areas of knowledge written down on sheets of paper, and they have a piece of string. And what they have to do is they have to place these different areas of knowledge on a spectrum along that string. The idea being that at one end of the spectrum, the knowledge, the subject matter is very objective, very certain, very absolute, timeless, and universal. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we're talking about knowledge or content or subject matter that is much more subjective, uncertain, relative, time-dependent, and personal. And so when you think about this in relation to the subjects, you can see that you could argue, for example, that a subject like mathematics is much more objective than a subject like the arts, where if we interpret a poem, it's much more subjective, it's much more personal. Something like ethics tends to be a little bit more uncertain and subjective. It's also very cultural. The natural sciences we think of as being quite objective, but there are also limitations which make it slightly less absolute, less certain than mathematics. And so what the students are doing here is they're starting to think about the differences and the similarities across the different areas of knowledge. They're also starting to ask questions about certainty, about evidence, about truth, and also about the methods we use in these different subject areas to make decisions, to answer questions about knowledge. And here they're at work, and what you can see, they've got their string, they've got their keywords here, they're discussing very carefully where to place the keywords, but they're also having to justify their decision. And one of the big questions we ask is about the implications of where they're going to place different words. So if they place arts, for example, as being very, very subjective, they then have to talk about, well, what does that mean? Does it mean that we can never find truth in the arts? Does it mean that we shouldn't judge the arts at all because it's very personal and very subjective? And then if they talk about the implications for putting, for example, mathematics at the other end of the scale, they might be talking about questions like, well, if maths is so universal, is it really about the real world or is it something abstract? Because the real world, as we know, is very uncertain and unstable. So is maths really useful in the real world? Okay, so all kinds of questions can come out of this activity, and it's just a way of visualizing the thinking of the students, making it visible so they can track it and trace it over time. Another big question we ask with students is how reliable are the methods we use to generate knowledge in different subject areas? So to give you an example of this, this is another visible thinking routine that I use with students in theory of knowledge. And what they have to do is pick a subject, like biology, and they then have to ask questions related to methodologies, the methods we use in biology, the ways of knowing that are used in biology, and also what level of certainty can we reach when we're making claims in the subject. So for example, students will think about the role of hypothesis and experiment and observation and data collection in biology. They'll talk about whether the methodology of the sciences, and of biology in particular, is an individual or a group process. They'll ask about the role of peer review in the sciences. They'll ask whether there's one universal method or many different methods in the sciences, perhaps based on different cultures. And then here in the ways of knowing, they'll decide, yes, there is some reasoning going on in biology, but what kind of reasoning? Is it deductive? Is it inductive? What kind of reasoning is happening? They'll also talk about the language that's being used. How objective is the language? How subjective is it? They'll ask about sense perception as another way of knowing. How do we use the senses when we're observing an experiment, a scientific experiment? And what are the limitations of our senses, particularly, for example, when we're looking through a microscope? And if one scientist looks through the microscope and then another scientist does the same thing, is that going to lead to the same observation and the same result? And the role of intuition and imagination is another big question in the sciences. They might then have to put this on a scale of 1 to 10. So how reliable is knowledge in biology and the sciences? Is it universal or subjective? And how useful is it really based on all these ideas? And this is very powerful because it gets students to break down all the different aspects of biology into things like methodology, ways of knowing, and levels of certainty and reliability, and to consider whether, in fact, the sciences are really as reliable and really as certain as we might assume them to be. So the reason why this is so powerful for students is not just when they do it once for one subject, but it's when they start to make the comparisons across the different areas of knowledge. And so this chart actually reflects what one class of students came up with, or one group in a class came up with, when they were comparing methodologies, ways of knowing, certainty and reliability across all these different areas of knowledge. And this is where the really powerful critical thinking starts to happen. Because what they're starting to think about is, first of all, what are the different methods that we use to attain knowledge in different areas of knowledge? So with the arts, we can talk about knowledge being private, subjective, internal. It's open to interpretation. But also, interestingly, when you get to the natural sciences, you realize, there's also some interpretation of data going on there too. So what are the differences and the similarities across these two areas of knowledge? And then the next question, of course, would be, so if there's interpretation in the natural sciences, then how certain can we be? If there are different interpretations of the same data, how reliable does that make the knowledge that we produce in that particular subject? And then the other area for comparison is the ways of knowing. So we look at things like sense perception, we look at reasoning, we look at emotion, we look at the role of the imagination across these different areas of knowledge. And then we come up with some general ideas about the levels of certainty and reliability across these different areas of knowledge. And this is very, very powerful because one of the most important things in critical thinking is that understanding for students of how we need to use the knowledge to actually make change in the real world. And when they start thinking about questions of reliability, that's going to make them much more careful when it comes to actually taking action based on the knowledge claims they think they have. And so that's a very important learning and understanding for the students. So another question we ask with students is, how does knowledge in the different subject areas change over time? And what are the implications for certainty, truth, and also knowledge in action? So for example, we'll talk about the natural sciences and we'll talk about paradigm shifts and how knowledge in the sciences changes gradually over time. We'll talk about how chance discoveries sometimes happen. So it's not just about the scientific method, but sometimes a scientist will discover something by chance. We'll talk about new research and how that gets peer-reviewed by all the scientists in the community. And also talk about the role of technology in helping to bring greater certainty and greater reliability to the experiments that science and scientists do. And then we'll also talk about another area of knowledge, such as the arts. How does knowledge in the arts change over time? So for example, what a work of art means can change over time. If you see a work of art like this 100 years ago, we would interpret it differently to the way we might interpret it today. Viewers in the 21st century have a different frame of reference to viewers in, for example, medieval England. We have different roles in life, we have a different understanding of the world, so we perceive the art in a different way. We could talk about the monetary value of art, fluctuating and changing over time depending on the taste of people or depending on the culture of the people who are looking at the work of art. And then we can also talk about artistic movements like Impressionism and Cubism and how these are influenced by external factors like economics, politics, cultural change, and also historical events. So the implications of this are very important. Again, I'm talking here about once students have managed to think critically about these questions, the next step is to really think about what are the implications of this in the real world. So for example, does this mean that even science can never be certain if it's always changing? Should we therefore not take any action based on a scientific claim? And one of the big questions of our time, of course, is global warming. And we know that roughly 98–99% of scientists agree that global warming is caused by human activity. but what about the 1%? So at what point do you say we should take action? And at what point do you say, actually, we need more certainty, more evidence? Should we just do the best we can based on the available evidence? Sometimes we just need to take action because we need to do something, even though we don't have 100% certainty. And so those are some of the lessons that students learn and think about when they're thinking about the relationship between critical thinking, assessing knowledge claims, and actually taking action based on those claims in the real world. And this is another visible thinking routine, which is essentially asking that question: how does knowledge change over time? And what students do here is they will draw a graph based on their research of how knowledge has changed, and they'll look at the shape of the graph, and they'll ask themselves, well, what happened at this point that made knowledge move forward? And then why did knowledge move down at this point in history? And then why did it go up again? And so the graphs across the different areas of knowledge can look very different. In fact, some students have said the graph goes from the top all the way down because actually the more we know, the more we realize we don't know. And therefore, over time, we know less. So that's one way of looking at the growth of knowledge over time. So the next big important question is, how does the identity of the knower impact knowledge in different subject areas? So how might gender, culture, personality, or even prior knowledge affect the knowledge that he or she generates? And so one way of looking at this, and this is another visible thinking routine, is to get students to think about areas like gender, personality, culture, prior knowledge, experience, and personal beliefs. And the idea is to take a knowledge claim and to assess that claim, that person's claim, in relation to all these things. So how has my gender affected my belief? How has my personality affected the way I think about this question? What about my culture? As a Korean person or as an American or a British person, how does that affect the way I think and feel about this particular topic? And so we get students to really think very, very closely about themselves in relation to the knowledge claims that they're making, the beliefs they have. And just to give you an example of this, taking history as an area of knowledge, we could say, for example, that there are male historians and female historians, and perhaps they actually have different ideas about history just because of their gender. In terms of culture, does the culture of the historian have an impact on perhaps the level of bias they might have towards one nation or towards another culture, and would that affect the writing of the history, the way they write the history? Personal beliefs, so your political or your personal beliefs can also lead to a different interpretation of historical sources. And you see this when you compare and contrast different histories, different resources in history, and the kinds of interpretations they've made of those different historical sources. And then in terms of implications, we could say some histories, such as women's history, have been left out for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that this in turn has helped to strengthen and prolong patriarchy, that sense of male dominance over the human population. And so that's a very important implication to consider out of all these ideas, particularly relating to gender. Different cultures end up with different histories. That's another implication. You know, the history of North Korea, the history of South Korea is going to be very different depending on who writes the history. So you're going to get a different sense of the past and the way that happened. And then, for example, Holocaust revisionism, Holocaust denial, there is the implication that if we allow these things to be denied, then they're more likely to be repeated in the future. So again, what we're getting students to do is not just to think about all the critical thinking, the knowledge questions up here, but down here to think about the implications of that, what that means in the real world, in a global context, and also in their personal lives. Here's another example of the same question, but students did this one slightly differently. In this case, they took a personal belief, and the personal belief they took was, I know it isn't good to disrespect one's parents. This was a student who came up with this statement, this knowledge claim. And what they're doing here is they're taking themselves as the knower, the person making the claim, and they're asking, so what are the different parts of my life, my gender, my culture, my background, my education, my parents, how have all these different things affected that belief that I have? And so this particular student came up with the idea of her age makes a big difference in her beliefs. She also talked about her social class. She talked about her personality. She talked about her languages and her religion. This particular student was Buddhist, and Buddhism teaches us to respect our elders, and so that's how that belief was instilled in her. And so the idea is it gives students a very strong sense that their beliefs, their ideas are not necessarily fixed, but have actually been are dependent on other things around them, and that they can change over time, and that's very important. So another very important question we ask in theory of knowledge and in critical thinking is, what do we know and how do we know it? And this is where students start to explore that question of how do we know things? What are the ways of knowing that we use to come up with our knowledge claims? And so what I'll ask students to do is to make statements about things they know, anything at all, okay? So things like, I love folk music. Red is my favorite color. The angel was dressed in white. Maybe they read that in the Bible or something like that, okay? But then the key part is to ask for justification, and the student has to think carefully about how they came to know these things. And I'll just take you through a few examples. So here, okay, I love folk music. Where does that come from? Is it emotional? So are my emotions telling me that I love folk music? Is it rational and reasonable in the sense maybe I've read up about the history of folk music and I've realized that it's a very important part of culture and therefore I should know more about it. So there's more of a rational approach to the question. Red is my favorite color. Again, emotion plays a big part, but also experience. You know, if you find yourself putting on red clothes more often than not, then clearly your experience is telling you that red is your favorite color. This one could be about perception. We could be talking about, for instance, a passage in the Bible where a real person has described seeing an angel. So there is an element of perception or possibly imagination. Perhaps it happened in a dream. But there's also the religious aspect to this area of knowledge, which is that perhaps because of their religious faith, they believed that they saw an angel. So we're starting to think about all these different ways that we can come to know things. And I'll just skip down here a little. Good people go to heaven. Now, I've put language as a way of knowing here because perhaps this is something they read in the Bible or in a religious text. And so the language becomes their justification for knowing something. Interpretation goes hand in hand with language. So if you're looking at the Bible and you're using language to support your claim that good people go to heaven, that also involves an element of interpretation. Some words might have been translated from other languages, and so that all plays into the ways in which we justify these claims. This one down here, the sun is 93 million miles from the Earth, that's more of a scientific claim. And so clearly you're going to have perception, reasoning, and in this case mathematical reasoning to support that claim. And then again, the ruins of Troy are in modern-day Turkey. Well, perhaps personal experience, if this particular person has actually visited and seen with their own eyes. So it involves personal experience, observation, language, and also faith. And I say faith here because sometimes, and this is very common among students, we read things in textbooks, but we don't actually know them for ourselves. So it's important for students to recognize that a lot of what they hear and they read is taken on faith. It's a faith in the teacher, it's a faith in the authority of a textbook, it's a faith in the research that's behind the information in a textbook. And so that leads students to be much more questioning about the kinds of knowledge they receive from teachers, but also from textbooks and other sources. So this brings me to the final question that I want to address, which is about how we explore cultural knowledge using visible thinking strategies at Branksome Hall, Asia. And there's three very important knowledge questions that we address here. The first is, how does culture affect knowledge? The second is, what, if anything, can we learn from other cultures? And the third is, are all cultural perspectives equally valid? And so the first step we take is that as a class, we start to explore and brainstorm ideas about what we call cultural icebergs. And the key questions here are, which aspects of culture are above the surface in the iceberg, and which aspects of culture are hidden or below the surface? And once we've done that, I will ask then students in pairs to create their own diagrams of a cultural iceberg relating specifically to their own culture. So just to show you what this looks like, this really tells you all the aspects of culture that are either above the surface and very, very visible to the naked eye. For example, if I come to Korea for the first time, I can see these differences very clearly. I can see that there's gender differences, people are behaving in certain ways, there are physical characteristics about the culture, the language is different, the clothes are different, and so on. So that's all visible, that's easy to see. But there's so much under the surface that we cannot see. Some of it's not visible at all, and some of it's just less visible. So we'll talk about things like body language. Okay? We'll talk about family traditions, which you don't see necessarily. They're quite hard to identify for somebody outside the culture. And then even deeper down, thought patterns, basic assumptions, worldview, attitudes. So what I will do is get students to brainstorm all these aspects of their own culture and to place them somewhere on the iceberg, whether they're visible, whether they're less visible, or whether they're absolutely not visible at all. So here's an example of one student's set of ideas for Korean culture. And so they came up with some very interesting ideas. They talked about, for example, the difference between collectivism and individualism when they're comparing Korean and American culture. They talked about attitudes towards elders in Korea. They talked about the difference in age ranges between the older, more conservative population in Korea and the slightly more progressive, younger people in the country. They talked also about levels of interaction with other cultures and the extent to which Korean culture is either open or closed in relation to other cultures. They also came up with this idea about lookism, which they believe is quite a big part of Korean culture. So these are the kinds of ideas that students come up with. And then the next step is for students to read short extracts from relating to culture and cultural beliefs. They then summarize the main points verbally to the group. But then the key part, the big sort of project that comes out of this, is that students choose from a number of knowledge questions relating to culture, and they have to provide a visual response to them. So this is an infographic produced by a group of students. It's based around the question, what, if anything, can we learn from other cultures? And the idea is essentially to put down as many ideas as possible around the question, based on the readings that they've read, based on their cultural icebergs that they've already brainstormed and thought about. But also it's a visible thinking activity because it's not just using language, it's also using any kind of visual that they want to use, particularly for concepts and ideas that they might find difficult to express, and that's the important part of it. So they really love and enjoy doing this, and it comes up with a lot of very interesting and original ideas and thinking. So, in summary, what are the key knowledge questions that we've asked in this presentation? So these are the key questions we've asked. What does it mean to know something? How do we know the things we think we know? How do we generate great knowledge questions? How do we define and use key terms accurately so that we can express them more clearly? What are the differences and similarities between the areas of knowledge? How does knowledge change over time? What is the impact of the knower on knowledge? And then finally, how does culture impact knowledge? Okay, so just to finish off and to summarize, I just want to summarize the key teaching points that we need to consider. So number one, sound critical thinking is vital because our knowledge claims do lead to action and they do have an impact on the world, and students really need to understand that. Secondly, critical thinking starts with asking great knowledge questions, and so students need to know how to formulate those questions and then to explore the questions in depth. Thirdly, students must think carefully about the definitions of key words. It's vital that they understand how to interpret, how to define these terms, and that they're using them accurately, because misuse can lead to misinformation and untruth. And then finally, it's really important that thinking is visible in the classroom. The more you can get students to really visualize their thinking and to map it out visually, then the more likely they are to explore their own thinking, to be able to track their thinking over time, and also to be able to identify the strengths and the areas for improvement in their thinking processes. Thank you very much.